The heavy rain drummed relentlessly on the roof of Harrow House as the last box was carried through its ancient doorway. Thomas and Eleanor Marshall, along with their two children, Lydia and Samuel, had moved from their bustling city life to the remote reaches of the English countryside in search of peace and quiet. The house, an imposing structure of stone and timber, had stood for over 3 centuries, nestled within a grove of gnarled oak trees whose branches swayed like the frantic arms of specters in the gusting wind. As they settled into their new home, the family initially dismissed the peculiar chill in the air and the way sounds seemed to echo through the halls as mere quirks of the old building. However, it wasn't long before the inexplicable incidents began. It started with faint whispers in the night, so soft that one might believe them to be the remnants of dreams. Then came the shadows that flickered at the edge of vision, disappearing when looked upon directly but increasingly bold as days passed. Within a month of their arrival, Lydia, the youngest, complained of fatigue and a persistent chill she couldn't shake off. Eleanor attributed it to the damp countryside air and perhaps the stress of the move. But when Samuel also began to show symptoms, pale skin, dark circles under his eyes, and a lethargy so profound it kept him bedridden for hours, Eleanor's concern deepened. Dr. Hawthorne, the local physician, was summoned. After thorough examinations, he confessed his bafflement. Their conditions do not align with any known ailment, he admitted, his voice tinged with unease. His old eyes flickered with a trace of fear as he glanced around the dimly lit room. I suggest you keep the rooms well lit and warm. Perhaps it is the dampness or something else. That night, as Eleanor tended to her children, she saw it for the first time, the ghost. It was a fleeting glimpse of a figure through the slightly ajar door of the library, a woman in a tattered gown, her face obscured by the shadow of her hair, drifting silently across the room before vanishing into the dark recesses of the house. Terrified but desperate, Eleanor sought out the history of Harrow House the following morning. The local librarian, an elderly woman with a treasure trove of stories, provided the chilling details. Harrow House was once owned by the Harrow family, and the last of the lineage was Lady Elizabeth Harrow, a reputed healer who turned to dark arts after the tragic death of her family. Accused of witchcraft, she was shunned by the community, and it was rumored she had cursed the house and its future inhabitants. Convinced that the ghost of Lady Elizabeth was haunting them and possibly the source of the children's illness, Thomas and Eleanor sought out more supernatural solutions. They contacted a renowned psychic, Madame Fiora, who agreed to visit Harrow House. Madame Fiora's presence intensified the spectral activities. Doors slammed shut, cold winds swept through closed rooms, and eerie laments echoed down the halls. During her seance, the psychic confirmed their fears. Lady Elizabeth's spirit is bound to this house, and she spreads sickness to any who dwell here, she declared, her voice trembling as she spoke. Her anger, her pain. It's a plague upon this house. The medium attempted to communicate with the spirit, to persuade her to find peace. But the effort seemed to provoke the apparition to a terrifying degree. The lights flickered violently, and a scream filled the house, so piercing that it shattered the glass windows. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, silence fell. In the silence that followed Madame Fiora's disastrous seance, the Marshall family felt a shift in the atmosphere of Harrow House. The air grew heavier, the shadows darker, and the cold more biting. Despite the shattered windows, not a single breeze stirred the stagnant air. Thomas, feeling a surge of protectiveness, decided they could not spend another night in Harrow House. He arranged for the family to stay at a nearby inn while they figured out their next steps. But leaving the house did not bring the relief they had hoped for. At the inn, Lydia's condition worsened. Her fever spiked, and delirium took hold, causing her to speak in a voice not her own, uttering phrases in what sounded like Latin. Samuel, too, became more withdrawn, speaking less and less, staring blankly at walls as if seeing something his parents could not. Eleanor, frantic with worry, reached out to Madame Fiora once again. The psychic, shaken by her last encounter, was hesitant but agreed to help. The spirit of Lady Elizabeth is not confined to the house alone, she explained. Her curse latches onto anyone who becomes a resident, haunting them wherever they might go. Determined to break the curse, Thomas delved deeper into the history of Lady Elizabeth Harrow. His research took him to the archives of the local church where the Harrow family records were kept. Buried within aged texts, he discovered a forgotten scandal. Lady Elizabeth had not been the villain history painted her as, rather, she was a victim of her time, accused of witchcraft because she practiced medicine that was ahead of her era. Thomas learned about a hidden burial site on the grounds of Harrow House, where Lady Elizabeth was rumored to have buried her young daughter, who had died under mysterious circumstances. Perhaps, Thomas theorized, Lady Elizabeth's unrest was tied to her daughter's unmarked grave, her spirit unable to find peace until her child was properly remembered and mourned. Armed with this new understanding, the Marshals returned to Harrow House, accompanied by Madame Fiora and a local priest, Father Henley. They conducted a ritual to uncover and sanctify the hidden grave. As they dug into the earth, a small, crude coffin was revealed. Inside, perfectly preserved, lay the tiny skeleton of a child with a locket containing a portrait of Lady Elizabeth. Father Henley performed a blessing over the grave, and Madame Fiora led a séance to communicate with Lady Elizabeth's spirit. This time, the atmosphere was charged with sorrow rather than malice. Through Madame Fiora, Lady Elizabeth's spirit spoke of her grief and her fierce desire to protect her child from the accusations that had plagued them both. With her story acknowledged and her child finally given a proper burial, the ghost of Lady Elizabeth appeared before them, not as a fearsome specter, but as a weeping mother. She thanked the Marshals for freeing her from her eternal torment and promised that no harm would come to them or any future inhabitants of Harrow House. As her spirit faded away, the house itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and for the first time since their arrival, the sun broke through the clouds, casting warm light through the windows. In the weeks that followed, Lydia and Samuel recovered fully. The inexplicable illnesses that had plagued them disappeared as mysteriously as they had arrived. The Marshals decided to stay in Harrow House, no longer a place of fear and sickness, but a home filled with a sense of peace and history. In the weeks following the spirit's release, Harrow House seemed transformed. The air was lighter, the shadows less menacing. Lydia and Samuel thrived, regaining their health and spirits. Yet, the peace was short-lived. Despite the rituals and blessings, a lingering darkness clung to the corners of the venerable home, unnoticed at first in the relief that followed the haunting. As autumn approached, the chill returned with greater intensity, and with it, a subtle but unmistakable sense of foreboding crept back into the house. The children, once vibrant and healthy, began to complain of nightmares that left them weary during the day. Eleanor, too, felt a persistent dread, as if watched by unseen eyes. One fateful evening, as Thomas stoked the fireplace, a sudden cold gust swept through the room, extinguishing the fire and plunging the house into darkness. In the blackness, a faint, heart-wrenching sob echoed through the halls, chillingly familiar yet unmistakably different. It was not the sorrowful cry of Lady Elizabeth they had heard and recognized her pain. This was something else, something darker. Alarmed by the resurgence of supernatural occurrences, Thomas revisited the church archives, driven by a desperate need to understand what they had missed. There, buried beneath layers of dust and forgotten with time, he found a series of letters between the church and a feared witch hunter who had visited Harrow House shortly after Lady Elizabeth's death. The letters spoke of a second presence in the house, an entity that had been attracted to the dark energies resulting from the injustices done to Lady Elizabeth and her daughter. This malevolent spirit, never human and fueled by the curse and despair, had remained dormant, overshadowed by Lady Elizabeth's more powerful emotions. When the family intervened and Lady Elizabeth's spirit was released, they inadvertently strengthened this darker force, allowing it to rise in her stead. Realizing the grave error, the Marshals, with the aid of Madame Fiora and Father Henley, prepared for one final confrontation. They gathered all known relics and texts that could offer protection and performed a cleansing ritual intended to banish the malevolent spirit. However, the entity was ancient and strong, fueled by centuries of sorrow and bitterness that seeped into the very foundations of Harrow House. As the family and their allies recited the incantations, the house itself seemed to turn against them, with doors slamming shut, trapping each member in different parts of the vast, dark mansion. The ritual, incomplete and improperly executed under such chaos, failed disastrously. The spirit, enraged and now fully unleashed, took its revenge. The house shook violently, windows shattered, and one by one, the screams of the Marshall family echoed through the night, silenced only by the sinister quiet that followed. When the local authorities investigated, Harrow House stood eerily silent, its halls cold and suffused with a lingering sadness. No trace of the Marshall family was ever found, their fate a haunting mystery that deterred any future inhabitants. The house was eventually abandoned, left to decay, its dark windows like blind eyes watching over a legacy of tragedy. Rumors spread across the countryside of the cursed house, where whispers in the wind spoke of a family who tried to fight the darkness but were instead consumed by it. Harrow House, once a home filled with hope and new beginnings, became a monument to the unseen horrors that lurk in the shadows of history, waiting for the unwary to awaken them.